Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 23, Bolivia. So today's drink of choice is mocochinchi. It's a peach drink that apparently is commonly sold in markets in Bolivia. It's pretty much a peach soaked in water, mixed with sugar, cinnamon, a bit of orange, and a hint of lemon. You serve it cold and sweet, and it's pretty good. It's not super difficult to make. The cinnamon flavor is nice. It does admittedly look like you're drinking super dirty water, so yeah. It's probably like an 8 out of 10. The recipe is in the description if you want to look at it. But let's start talking about Bolivia. The plurinational state of Bolivia is landlocked in South America, with Brazil to the north and east, Paraguay to the southeast, Argentina to the south, and Chile and Peru to the west. It uniquely has two capitals, one at the city of La Paz, where the country's president and legislative assembly is located, and another at Sucre, which is where the Supreme Court is located. Bolivia can generally be divided between the highlands and the mountains found in the southwest, and then the more low-lying plains that are found in the far north and east of the country. These low-lying plains can range from tropical forests making up the outer reaches of the Amazon, to tropical savannas, and even some more quasi-arid areas. Bolivia has around 11.5 million people in it. Most people in the country are mixed to some extent. This means not just mixed in terms of racial groups like indigenous, white, and African, but also mixed in terms of their ethnic group. For example, from Europe, Spaniards, Germans, and Croatians make up some of the largest white subgroups. The indigenous population has some of the highest diversity, with 30 to 40 groups being present in the country. Some of the largest are the Aymara in the west, the Quechua in the southwest, and the Guarani in the south. People are often divided between white Bolivians, mestizo or mixed Bolivians, and Indian, native, or indigenous Bolivians. But these groups aren't concrete, and there is some flexibility in terms of which group you belong to, with culture being the biggest thing that defines your relationship with these groups. Also in the country, there is a cultural division between people from the west, the Colas, and people in the east, the Cambas. Language-wise, most people will speak Spanish, with 75% being able to speak the language either as a first, second, or third language, and is particularly dominant in the east. However, Bolivia also has many speakers of indigenous languages, with 43% being able to speak at least one native language. The languages of Quechua, Aymara, and Guarani are the most popular, being spoken by 25, 16.5, and 0.5% of the population respectively. 37 languages are recognized as official languages, with the 4 we have already mentioned all being official languages, and the remaining 33 languages being various native ones found throughout the country. Religion-wise, Bolivia is largely Christian, with roughly 90% being a part of some Christian church. Catholicism is by far the most popular, with around 70% being Catholic, although many are lay Catholics who will attend Mass irregularly. After that, there is another 15 to 20% belonging to Protestant groups, such as Methodists, Mennonites, and Pentecostals. Other smaller groups include Mormons, Baha'is, and some of the traditional native religious groups, who may or may not mix Christianity with their own indigenous beliefs. There is also around 3 to 10% who are irreligious. Bolivia's early history had sharp distinctions between the highlands and the lowlands. As a broad stereotype, you can say during pre-Columbian times, the highlands was where most of the major cities and empires were located, while the lowlands were largely hunter-gatherers, small agricultural societies, and a couple small city-states. In the west, some of the earliest civilizations were and I'm so sorry if you are from Bolivia, I'm going to try my best, but I can't promise any of my pronunciations will be good. The Chavan civilization, the Tiahuanaco Empire, and the Wadu Empire. Starting in the 12th century, the Aymara people began moving into western Bolivia and settled down. The Aymara were not united as a single people, but were divided into several different kingdoms, with fortified settlements, llama herding, and gold production being some of the mainstays of these kingdoms. They were a communal society, sharing resources in their kin groups, known as Aylus, while also being subordinate to the chiefs and nobles that reigned over them. In the mid-1400s, the Aymara would be subjugated by the Incan Empire, who came from Peru in the north, and brought with them the Quechua language and culture. They crushed the Aymara nobles who resisted, but largely left most of the noble class alone, so long as they didn't challenge Incan rule. The Incans connected Bolivia to its territory up north, and brought goods as far north as Colombia and as far south as Chile to the Bolivians under their rule. Most of Bolivia still laid outside the Incans' control. They made several attempts to expand out into the lowlands, but these often had only limited success, or were driven back by the various tribes and small kingdoms there. The Incans' rule would ultimately be fairly short-lived. In 1524, Spanish conquistadors conquered the Incan Empire, and slowly began making their way into Bolivia, at first via Peru, but also colonizing the lowlands from Paraguay and northern Argentina, taking most of the country by the 1560s. Although Spanish rule in the north and in some rural areas was limited to almost non-existent, with several small tribes being uncontacted up till even today. The Spanish would bring with them their language, religion, and culture, along with old world foods and animals, and, unfortunately, their diseases, which would wipe out large sections of the native population. Bolivia, or as it would be known in colonial times, Upper Peru, would serve as a resource extractor for the Spanish. Resources like wheat, the natives' cloth, sugar, gold, and the culturally important cocoa plant would all be collected in Upper Peru before being sent off to Spain to further enrich the Spanish Empire. All these, even up till today, play an important role in the Bolivian economy, although their importance has waxed and waned over time. However, the most lucrative resource would have to be without a doubt silver. Almost 60% of the silver mined in the entire world in the 16th century was found in just the city of Potosi in Bolivia. The city saw a massive boom, with many thousands coming from Spain to seek out the riches mining for silver, something that would make some men extremely wealthy, and also excited many due to colonial Bolivia offering white men greater social mobility compared to back in Spain. Natives also had to work the mines, with a draft forcing around 1/7 of all native men from Potosi to Cusco in Peru being expected to spend at least a year working the mines in the city, and these men would often bring along their families for their stay in the mines. A limited number of African slaves would also be brought in. The mixing of cultures from Spain, Africa, and various native groups all created the beginnings of the mestizo culture in the country, with intermarriage becoming quite common in the city. The conditions in the mines themselves were fairly brutal, with workplace injury being extremely common. Upper Peru for most of colonial history was under the viceroyalty of Peru based in Cusco. Later, in 1776, it would fall under colonial Argentinian rule. But whether it was ruled from either Cusco or Buenos Aires, it was largely autonomous from either. Upper Peru was so rich that the local elites in the area were able to effectively remain largely independent from the colonial governors from other parts of the Spanish Empire. These local elites would build many cities in the region, bringing with them European universities, Catholic cathedrals, and the latest and hippest architecture of the era. However, the elites of Upper Peru peaked in the 1650s, and after this point, the silver mines started growing dry, and with that, the economy of Upper Peru suffered. Overall, the natives' experience under Spanish rule had the natives being moved around geographically and forced to accommodate or work for the Spanish overlords. While natives in Bolivia weren't exterminated like the Taino people on Hispaniola, they had to suffer their fair share of abuse, like exploitative and cruel Spanish landlords and bosses, displacement, attempts to stamp out their native faith and culture, and just generally racist perceptions of them. Throughout colonial history, there would be many small and localized rebellions, often against a law or official, that upset the natives of the region, but never any serious attempts to remove the Spanish. This would be until 1780, when the native Quechua and Aymara people went into revolt throughout the Andes, led by revolutionary Tupac Amaru II. While most of the rebellion was concentrated in Peru, another native leader, Tupac Atari, would lead rebels in Upper Peru, sieging La Paz for 6 months, and sought to create an independent state in the region. While the rebellion would be put down, the rebellion and Tupac Atari have served as important symbols for the native population of Bolivia, and as a symbol of resistance. Briefly, we have to talk about events going on back in Spain. Spain had entered the Napoleonic Wars and was under the control of France, who had driven the Bourbon kings out of Spain. Spanish America laid outside Napoleon's control, but the instability going on in Spain led many colonial subjects to question who was really in charge back in Europe. In 1809, in the city of Chuquisaca, white elites upset with the instability and lack of representation given to the city, and inspired by Enlightenment ideals, attempted to form their own government. La Paz similarly attempted to form its own government, promising radical social reform and greater rights for the mestizo population of Upper Peru. Both rebellions would be crushed, but this would start the fight for independence in Bolivia, and generally would be considered the start for the Latin American Wars of Independence. However, the fight for independence in Upper Peru would remain very weak. The independence movement largely consisted of a limited number of rural revolutionaries. At several points in the next 10 years, Argentina, which had broken away from Spain, would attempt to use its army to liberate Upper Peru. However, they were largely unsuccessful, as the Argentinian army had done a very good job plundering the region, but not that good of a job governing or defeating the Spanish. Ironically, by 1824, with most of South America free of Spanish rule, only Upper Peru, the region that had first started to rebel, remained under colonial rule. In 1824, the troops of Venezuelan revolutionary Simon Bolivar, led by his general Antonio José de Sucre, defeated royalist forces at the Battle of Ayacucho, and a little under a year later, Upper Peru was fully liberated. With this victory, it brought the question of what should happen to Upper Peru. Should it join Peru? Argentina? Join a pan-Latin American type of country? Well, for many elites in the region, they feared being subjugated, and wanted to keep their autonomy they had during colonial times. So, some started pushing for independence. Bolivar eventually agreed to this, largely because these elites agreed to name the new country after him, Bolivia, and because he was fighting with Peruvian elites at the time, and didn't want to give his potential political opponents a large source of manpower and resources. So in 1825, Bolivia became independent, and it was left in a weak spot. The Bolivian economy was still struggling, with the depletion of some of the largest silver mines. Tariffs towards other countries around Bolivia and the loss of the Spanish colonial bureaucracy all didn't really help matters for the new state. Sucre would become president by the end of 1825, and attempted to promote liberal reform. He attempted to remove unpopular colonial taxes and legal restrictions, while also attacking the Catholic Church's role in the country. Sucre actually got a city named after him, with Chuquisaca changing its name to Sucre, one of the capitals of the country we talked about at the start. However, an attempted coup and an assassination attempt would encourage Sucre to leave the country in 1828. Within this climate of political uncertainty came Andres de Santa Cruz. He had first fought for the Royalists during the Wars of Independence, before switching to the Patriots and became a close ally of Bolivar. He would briefly become president of Peru before he became president of Bolivia in 1829. Santa Cruz would bring about reform and stability to the state, reforming the bureaucracy, instituting a new legal code, and attempting to remove corruption from the state. His biggest mark on history would be in relation to his attempts to merge Bolivia and Peru together. Peru at this time was undergoing unrest, with factions in the north and south of the country fighting each other for control. Santa Cruz would side with the southern faction, and managed to defeat the northern faction militarily. He would then merge Peru and Bolivia together, forming the Peru-Bolivian Confederation in 1836. This confederation, however, would face opposition in Peru from those opposed to Santa Cruz's heavy-handed approach to politics. The confederation would have been a very powerful state in South America, and Bolivia's neighbors in Chile and Argentina noticed. They feared a strong state on their northern border, and the two states attempted to crush the state, starting the War of the Confederation. While Santa Cruz and his allies would defend his new state for 3 years, by 1838 the Confederation began losing battles and was dissolved, with Santa Cruz losing power. From this point to 1880, Bolivia would enter a period of political instability. The country would first have to fight off Peruvian attempts to conquer the country. After the last invasion was defeated in 1847, the country would enter a period where politics was largely based around regional and military elites fighting each other for the country. Some presidents would enter periods of relative peace, while other presidents would have to fight quasi-civil wars against their political opponents. The military at this time received most of the state's budget, with around half of all funds picked up by the Bolivian state being spent on the military. It was said there was at one point 1 general for every 100 soldiers. But this mismanagement of funds will hopefully never backfire on the Bolivian establishment and bite them in the ass, so don't even worry about it. But also, surprisingly during this time, Bolivia would experience some economic growth and an increase in state revenue. This period would see the start of foreign companies operating in the country, which would play a large role in the country's growth later on. Now, one thing I should note about Bolivia is that it was bigger at the start of its independence than what it is now. It included parts of northern Argentina, the Gran Chaco region, parts of what are now Brazil, and included a vital coastline. However, these borders wouldn't last. First on the chopping block was some of Bolivia's territories in the north and east, which were given to Brazil in exchange for a better trade deal between the countries in 1867. However, debatedly, the most devastating territorial loss would occur in 1879. Bolivia's coastal region was largely desert and sparsely populated, and going into the 1870s, most of the population was made up of Chilean immigrants who had moved into the region to mine nitrate. In 1879, Bolivia tried to establish a tax on foreign companies in the region, which was rejected by the Chileans that settled there, and that year Chile invaded, largely crushing the Bolivian resistance and advancing into Peru in the War of the Pacific. Bolivian leadership during the war was poor, and generally the war was a mess on the Bolivian side. By 1884, Chile had won a decisive victory and turned Bolivia into a landlocked country. Skipping ahead a bit, in 1903 Brazilian settlers in the region of Acre declared independence, and then joined Brazil, taking with them the region's rubber. Bolivia finally formally ceded its coastal territory in 1904, but successive Bolivian governments have argued that a land corridor to the sea should be given to them. There is also apparently a holiday in Bolivia dedicated to remembering the War of the Pacific and arguing for land to be returned to the country. Back in 1880, the failure of the war resulted in the collapse of the Bolivian status quo. The period of military rule would come to an end, although generals would still play a big role in the country's politics. And regional politics ended. Kinda. Bolivia became divided between the political factions of the conservatives, who were often based in Sucre, and liberals, who were often based in La Paz. Generally, the political debates would be on if Bolivia should be a unitary or a federal state, how much power the government should have, and on certain economic policies. But the liberals and the conservatives were not mass political parties. They only attempted to appeal to the rich Spanish-speaking whites, and rarely, if ever, attempted to appeal to the mestizo or native populations of the country, with literacy and property requirements barring most people from voting or holding office. One important thing to note is that while civil wars and coups did happen, this period of Bolivian history remained mostly stable, especially compared to the previous 40-some years. Society during this period from 1880 to 1934 was paradoxically mostly the same, but also changing in some important ways. The economy remained largely stable for the beginning of this period, with tin becoming an increasingly more important resource for the country, and Bolivia became more connected with international markets. While some natives managed to move up by joining the mestizo class, many natives had to suffer under continued displacement, and generally ignored by the political establishment. Several native rebellions would occur, but they all failed. In 1899, a civil war between the liberals and the conservatives would break out, with the liberals winning, and for a brief moment, it seemed that maybe the mestizos and natives might get greater rights. But the liberals largely abandoned them after their victory. Change would start to come with the Great Depression, with Bolivia suffering economic decline due to its close connection to international markets. Discontent spread, and by 1932, Bolivian President Daniel Salamanca began to worry that he might be removed from power if he didn't manage to quickly win back support. That year, a border clash occurred in the Gran Chaco region, a disputed region between both Paraguay and Bolivia that was believed could be resource-rich, but was largely without large population centers. Salamanca declared war on Paraguay, hoping to use the war to boost his popularity, although much of the military establishment in both Bolivia and Paraguay were surprised by the decision to go to war. Popular retellings of the war tend to emphasize that the war was fought over oil, but, according to Robert S. Klein, he says the war was fought to save Salamanca's presidency, so I'm including it here in the episode. If you disagree with that, feel free to yell at me in the comments or via email. Bolivia hoped that the war would be the opposite of the War of the Pacific, and Bolivia could reverse its trend of losing more and more land. However, like the last war, Bolivia suffered under poor military leadership. Military command and the president clashed on the direction the war should go, and while Paraguay had less men and less equipment, they were just simply led better, and managed to defeat the Bolivian army. Around 25% of Bolivian soldiers that fought were either killed or captured. The Paraguayans were able to take almost all the disputed territory, and despite losing a couple minor battles at war's end, by 1935 it was clear Bolivia lost. Salamanca, by the way, didn't get to keep his job, and was overthrown in a coup halfway through the war. After the war, it was impossible for things to be the same. The Bolivian establishment had categorically failed to protect the country. After the war, a small period of military socialism was instituted, which importantly nationalized the oil industry in the country, and then after that, liberal reformers took control of the country. Finally, mass politics began, with liberals and conservatives forced to appeal to wider segments of the population, along with competing against Marxist and quasi-fascist parties. Within this environment emerged the Nationalist Revolutionary Movement, or MNR. The MNR is interesting. It was a party of the left, promoting economic nationalism and opposing free market economics and the traditional right, but also was initially supportive of the fascist movements in Europe, and came from the white middle class in the country. Over time, the MNR would emerge as one of the dominant parties in the early 40s. Bolivia would enter World War II in 1943 on the side of the Allies, largely just giving aid to America. The government at the time was then overthrown later that year by a combination of the MNR and the army. However, the MNR failed to gain power, as the military quickly betrayed them right after the coup, and sought support from a strange coalition of the traditional establishment, some more radical Catholic conservatives, and even Marxist anti-fascists. The MNR, while hurt by the betrayal, actually got the support they needed to take power, as they were able to present themselves as the only alternative to the status quo. And by 1949, the average worker, most of the middle class, and a decent chunk of the rural native peasantry gave their support towards the MNR. Political violence increased just about every year in the 40s, and with it, the MNR grew as well. After an election that was clearly won by the MNR had its results annulled, the MNR went into full revolt in 1952. Just in case you think the Bolivian military has suffered enough humiliation, the military lost this war, known now as the Bolivian National Revolution, in just 3 days, and the MNR took power in the country. The MNR came to power and brought some of the most radical change the country had seen. They instituted universal suffrage, giving the mestizo and native population the right to vote. They reduced the power of the military and nationalized the tin industry, and promised land reform in the country. They also moved Bolivia to a more pro-USA stance. While America at first was hostile towards the MNR, seeing them as a fascist movement, they began to warm up to them, hoping Bolivia could be an ally during the Cold War. Towards the early 60s, the MNR began to grow less popular, as Bolivia's economy declined due to less demand for tin on the world stage, and the middle-class support base abandoned the MNR. In 1964, the MNR was overthrown in a coup. Now, I'll talk about this really because if I don't, someone will yell at me about it. Marxist insurrections. The first Marxist rebellions would occur in the 30s, during the Great Depression, although these would all fail. The most famous Marxist insurrection would occur in 1966, when Argentine revolutionary Che Guevara and a group of his followers entered the country, hoping to use it as a starting point to spread Marxist revolution in Argentina and Brazil. Che and his followers would fail to actually connect with much of the Bolivian peasantry, or the communists operating in the country. He also would fail to establish contact with Cuba, who promised supplies. And in 1967, Bolivian troops aided by the CIA captured Che and executed him. Another Marxist rebellion would occur in 1970, but this would be largely uneventful, and most revolutionaries were too inexperienced to actually threaten the Bolivian state. After 1964, Bolivia would enter a period of quasi-military rule, with coups becoming quite common. The military was divided between those more sympathetic to the right and those more sympathetic to the left. In 1971, Hugo Banzer, supported by the US, came to power in a coup. Banzer really reaped the benefits of previous Bolivian regimes, with international markets allowing exports from Bolivia to be quite profitable, and education reform finally bringing about a generation of educated technicians who could help build up Bolivia. In particular, the city of Santa Cruz saw massive growth, and today is one of the largest cities in the country. Banzer would be remembered for his brutal crackdown on any opposition towards him. At first, this crackdown was largely targeted at just the indigenous right protesters and leftists, but later right-wing groups were targeted, and all political parties were banned. Popular pressure mounted, and after failing to pull off election fraud, Banzer was removed in a coup in 1978. After some more military coups and shenanigans, Bolivia entered into its longest democratic period in 1982. The period saw various political groups and parties come to power and then fade into obscurity. Neoliberal reform was quite popular by political leaders during this time, as many parts of the economy were privatized, with foreign companies increasing their influence in the country. Other changes occurring at this time included greater decentralization of the government, with more power given to municipalities, Spanish becoming a more dominant language in the country, and with that, a decline in native languages in everyday use. The Bolivian economy from the 1990s to the early 2000s was struggling, with general unrest increasing, and no political leader really able to maintain support over multiple elections. Indigenous rights activists had been active in Bolivia in various forms, from debatedly the times of the Spanish. However, the 80s and the 90s saw the dramatic increase of these movements. They largely grew in strength due to the privatization of many sectors of the economy, which led particularly in the East a consolidation of power in several wealthy agrarian families. And during this time, many natives were being displaced due to economic or environmental factors, poor working conditions, and a worry that native life and culture was being lost. The movement came onto the scene staging massive protests in the country, squatting on land that was being left unused, and participating in electoral politics. In 1998, the Movement for Socialism, or MOS, was formed, representing the indigenous and mestizo peasantry, along with trade unions, patriotic left-wingers, and progressive intellectuals, being headed by cocoa planter Evo Morales. In 2005, MOS would come to power in an election winning 54% of the vote, largely from the west of the country, and Morales coming to power. Morales' election would signify a new chapter in Bolivian politics. Morales would renationalize many industries. He would give non-whites greater political representation through MOS, increase spending on welfare, education, and infrastructure in the country, and moved away from the United States and towards other left-wing states and governments in the region, like Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. In 2009, Bolivia would change its constitution to give greater protections to indigenous communities and officially became the plurinational state of Bolivia, hoping to represent all nations that make up the country. This has earned MOS wide support among sub-segments of society, and its support base has largely doubled down on supporting MOS, pointing out that poverty has been cut in half in the country since Morales took office, and the economy has grown. Opposition towards MOS comes from several different places. The largest opposition comes from the right of MOS, arguing that MOS hasn't helped the country that much, which was, and still is today, one of the poorest in South America. The right-wing opposition tends to favor privatization and a free market or mixed economy, are found in the East, favor greater decentralization of the country, and greater protections around the Catholic Church. Many in the opposition fear that Morales and his allies have transitioned the country into an illiberal democracy, with opposition politicians being arrested and targeted. You can sometimes find almost a culture war between MOS supporters, who tend to wield symbols of Western native groups, like the Aymara or Quechua, and those who oppose MOS, who will sometimes wield symbols of the lowland natives, like the Guarani. You can also find indigenous activists criticizing MOS for not going far enough on some of its proposals, letting corruption happen, and backing down on some of their campaign promises. Famously, Morales was criticized for allowing a Brazilian company to build a highway through native land in the north of the country without consulting the natives in the region. This led to protests, and Morales was forced to back down on the project. Now let's start talking about probably the most controversial part of the episode, the Bolivian political crisis that occurred in 2019. But let's give a little bit of context. So, in that new constitution Morales made, it forced the president to adhere to a 2-term limit. He didn't count his first term under the old constitution, so by 2016 he was in the middle of his 2 terms under the new constitution. During that year, a referendum was held on if Bolivia should amend the term limit section of the constitution, which was rejected by the voters. However, in 2017, the Supreme Court of the country, which was made up of Morales loyalists, overturned the results, and allowed Morales to run again for another term. This set off alarm bells for the opposition, who feared that Morales was going to become a dictator. Also, another important thing to note is that Bolivia has a unique electoral system for presidential races. To make it brief, if any candidate wins over 50% of the vote, they will become president. If no candidate wins over 50% of the vote, then the top 2 candidates will move on to a second round of voting. But if one candidate wins 40 to 50% of the vote, and is 10 percentage points higher than the next best candidate, then they will win without having to go to a second round of voting. I know this is all a lot of context, but it will help explain some stuff later on. So on October 20th, 2019, Bolivia has a general election with Morales leading MOS. That night, while votes were being counted and reported, there was a sudden stoppage in the results being reported. During this time, Morales had 45% of the vote, and his main opponent, former President Carlos Mesa, had 38% of the vote. When reports started coming in again 24 hours later, Morales had won the election with 47% of the vote, and Mesa with 36.5% of the vote. This led most of the opposition to claim electoral fraud was taking place and took to the streets in protesting. Internationally, left-wing governments, along with China, Iran, and Russia, backed Morales, while right-wing states in Latin America, the US, and Spain backed the protest. After the Organization of American States released a report saying it was likely there was fraud, Morales announced new elections would be held. But by November the 10th, the police and the army had abandoned him, and the commander-in-chief of the Bolivian army suggested that Morales resign in order to bring peace and stability to the country, which Morales did, and then promptly fled the country. The fact that the head of the army pretty much told the president to resign led many pro-Morales people to accuse the army of carrying out a coup, and then they took to the streets and protesting in a reversal of the past 20 days. When Morales resigned, so did a bunch of his allies in protest. This all led to little-known opposition senator Janine Áñez to come to power, who was elected as the president of the Senate, and then through the line of succession became the president of the country. To say Áñez was polarizing would be a bit of an understatement. Pretty much half of the country rejected her as the legitimate president, while the opposition rallied around her to defend her. Áñez promised for a second round of elections and attempted to bring order to the country. This largely failed. As protesting continued, street clashes broke out, shortages occurred through many parts of the country, and the army and the police were called upon to bring order. Infamously, in early November, the Sincata and Sacapa massacres took place, with the government killing 19 indigenous protesters. In October 2020, new elections took place, with Mas candidate and Morales' ally, Luis Arce, winning the election, with 55% of the vote. Arce then became president and largely returned Bolivia to the pre-2019 status quo. He allowed Morales to return, reversed several policies the Áñez government had in place, and arrested figures like Áñez for taking power, and is accusing her of genocide. The situation in the country is still tense, and the country is currently struggling with COVID, a weak economy, and political disputes between different political and cultural groups. Or, in other words, business as usual in Bolivia. So why does Bolivia exist? Bolivia in many ways is rich. Rich in natural resources and rich in culture. But Bolivia has suffered since they were independent. They are one of the poorest countries in the region, lost large sections of their land, and have had to deal with political infighting since almost day one. Its goal for greater autonomy from its contemporaries led to it becoming independent, and demands from local governments, its indigenous communities, and its people more generally, have shaped how the country has grown. Let's hope that one day the people of Bolivia can find its autonomy that they have so desperately been searching for. Next time we will go to Bosnia and Herzegovina, prepare for a whole lot of ethnic infighting and genocide, a country being eaten by its neighbors, and we will ask, which part of the country is Bosnia and which part is Herzegovina? Thank you for watching. So yeah, sorry I haven't really uploaded in a while. Researching this country took a very, very long time. But hopefully I'll kind of get a little bit more of a regular schedule and I'll be posting more often for September. I know the next episode is going to be Russian political parties, and I've already started working on that a little bit, so I think like a week from this episode I'll be able to release that. And then after that, it's Portuguese political parties, and then the history of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. If you want, you can email me at whydocountries@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. The sources I use for this episode are AJ Plus's video, How a Farm Boy Became President and Then Lost It All, Al Jazeera's video, Bolivia Exit or Return, CGTN's news report on Luis Arce winning the Bolivian election, CNBC's video, Why McDonald's Failed in Bolivia, El Prof's video on the political history of Bolivia, Epimetheus' video on colonial Potosi, Nicola Fabricant's book Mobilizing Bolivia's Displaced, Geography Now's video on Bolivia, House of History's video on the Grand Chaco War, Herbert S. Klein's book, A Concise History of Bolivia, Mesa Man's video, Latin American Countries That No Longer Exist, Mr. History's video, A Super Quick History of Bolivia, and Wikipedia.